Okay, so I had to switch devices for a second, and now I'm back. So for the last 45 minutes, the thing that we have talked about in terms of Dr. Jekyll's full statement is we talked about, how this term gaiety, right, which seems to symbolize Dr. Jekyll's youthful sexual indiscretions, how that's been interpreted, and all of the various literary analysis that's been done about that. We're going to move past that, but unfortunately, we need to stay on a similar theme, right? Because suffice to say that there is a discussion of sexual immorality in that, and that's what's more important. Real quick, before we go any further, excuse me. What I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of the imagery in Jekyll and Hyde is borrowed from St. Paul, and it would be useful to have a quick review of some of that if we were to understand some of what Robert Louis Stevenson is doing. I'm quoting from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 7, beginning with verse 14 to the end of the chapter. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer that I do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members, right, another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with my mind I am a slave to the law of God, but with my flesh I am a slave to the law of sin. These glasses are giving me a headache. I'm going to switch to the other ones. So one of the things, right, that we talk about, as St. Paul uses this term, members, right? Members simply means body parts. But as Robert Louis Stevenson refers to members, it is pretty safe to say that members refers generally to sexual body parts. Now, you can refer to members as any part of the body. You can talk about, a hand being a member, a foot being a member, etc. But normally, right, you don't use another word to say hands and feet. Usually, especially in this kind of Victorian era, they use members particularly to talk about, shall we say, these less polite body parts. And one of the things that Dr. Jekyll says, and what he says is going on, is, excuse me guys, gotta keep this camera from going down. Let me grab some here that'll keep that from slipping down. This is why it's important to go through trial runs and try to find out what works and what doesn't. So let me set this here. That should keep it from slipping. Okay, I'm so sorry, guys. Trial and error. So the idea that we should be familiar with here is this idea of, he talks about from his youth, right? There is this war in his members, right? And this war in his members that Dr. Jekyll talks about is entirely in league and in reference with what St. Paul just talked about, right? The war in his members. And so in that sense, Jekyll and Hyde can also be read in this theological lens, right? One of the things that we should also remember in terms about the war and the members and this idea of a divided self, right? We might remember looking at Dr. Jekyll's house. Remember that if this is Dr. Jekyll's mansion, right? I know I'm an incredible artist, right? And all of the other major big houses, mansions, right? They were all divided into flats, right? They were divided into apartments based on the stories, remember? And one of the things but Dr. Jekyll, right, his house had not been turned into flats, turned into apartments, right? The idea is like this idea of a unified pretense or front, right? Versus a more obviously divided self, right? That's the symbolism of here. The idea is that he also refers he also makes certain references that also seem to indicate the similarity of talking about how his house is symbolic of different things, right? Remember that he talks about his inner self, right, referring to the tabernacle. We all know what a tabernacle is. It refers to the dwelling place of the Lord, the tent. We also call the place where we hold the Eucharist the tabernacle. And he also talks about sharing the womb with hide, right? He makes these expressions of dwelling place and division within them. And if we remember correctly, right, the idea of Jekyll's house is that even though he has a whole house, his house appears undivided, he appears wholly good, right? We know that he has the front house, right? And that might be whole and undivided, right? But then he also has the lab in the back, right? The lab, and this is also, where he has all his dirty little secrets, right? And this idea of the divided self and the war of the members, right, is going to be, not only does this contribute to this idea of repression, but also we should understand that this mention of members, right, and using certain phrases that have a very clear overtone, right, talks about being plunged in shame, right? This idea of being plunged in shame, it seems to be very much clearly indicating a kind, the word choice seems to indicate a kind of a sexual immorality, but also just the idea of what he's looking to overcome with Hyde is shame. Now, shame is an important thing to understand in context, okay? So here's our first context. Context one, right? Robert Louis Stevenson is a Presbyterian, right? And that means that he's this thing called a Calvinist, right? And as a Calvinist, right, one of the things that Robert Louis Stevenson believes in is this idea of utter or total depravity, right? It's a theological term, and basically total depravity in a Calvinistic sense means that human beings are basically all bad. They're totally ruined, they're totally broken, and everything about them needs to be redeemed. There's nothing good in them in and of themselves. One of the forerunners of this line of thinking was Luther. Luther was not as extreme as Calvin, but Luther gives this very famous analogy, which is a good analogy to use to describe Calvinism. He describes himself, Luther, as dung covered in snow. Right? Can't seem to spell snow. But dung covered in snow. And the idea is that if you cover anything with snow, it all looks beautiful, right? And the analogy that Luther uses is that grace covers up his being feces of a human being, and that what grace does ultimately is it makes what is nasty good. But it's still on the outside, right? The inside of a thing is essentially depraved, right? And so nothing good in human beings comes from human beings. It all comes from God from the outside. That's generally the idea of total depravity. Now, in Calvinistic thought, one of the things that always seems to indicate and really dwells on total depravity is everything related to sex, right? To a Calvinist, sex is intertwined deeply with original sin. Now, not all Calvinists believe this, but many Calvinists even went so far as to suggest that sex itself is the original sin. So there is this link between sex, members, depravity, and therefore shame, right? There's a lot of theological other connections that are going on, okay? Makes sense? So, in terms of what is Jekyll doing, right? On one hand, right, one of the ways in which he is dealing with his shame and his divided self is, unlike some people who we just kind of know are mixes of good and bad, like those flats, those houses carved up, is that he has his secret life, his secret compartment, his secret lab. And this, is very much akin to, say, The Secret Portrait of Dorian Gray. This is very much akin to The Secret of Frankenstein's Monster. This is very much akin to a lot of other kinds of hidden secrets, right? But the idea is that he keeps his shame hidden away in the lab, right? And this is not dissimilar to the actions of the noble people who would go to places like Soho and Whitechapel in order to sin, while in their dirty lab, right? That's their dark self, their bad self. While in public, right, like Dr. Jekyll's house, right, everything is clean, ordered, sober. This is an important term, sober, right? Clean, ordered, sober, and everything is under control, right? This is the duality of it. But when we talk about shame, we have to understand that shame has two elements that Dr. Jekyll is trying to escape. The first is just the feeling of guilt. Shame as guilt. One of the things that we need to be very clear about is that Jekyll wants the freedom to be able to delight in certain kinds of wickedness, particularly, it seems, the member kind of wickedness. Now, the idea of gaiety being associated with visiting prostitutes, right, for Jekyll, right, shame here is being associated with a kind of victimless crime, right? And as associated with victimless crime, right, Jekyll can say, look, I just don't want to feel shame, but I don't necessarily want to be hurt. Jekyll is always horrified by Hyde's violence, but he's not necessarily horrified by everything else he does, right? There's this element where part of what he wants is to be free of the psychological consequences of guilt, right? And that's partly what he wants to do. He wants the freedom to be able to delight in his wickedness, and in order to be able to delight in his wickedness, he doesn't want to be constantly feeling feelings of compunction. Now, the difference between guilt and shame, and this is important just on a psychological level, guilt should be understood as feeling bad because I did bad. Now, I'm speaking colloquially, right? I'm not using proper grammar here, but hopefully you can follow me, right? You do something bad and you feel bad. I feel bad because I did a bad thing. Shame, on an emotional level, does not say I did bad. It says I am bad because I did a bad thing. In the biblical sense of shame, if you go back to Genesis, shame has always been symbolized by Adam and Eve's fig leaves. Their awareness that they're naked, they're covering up, and they're hiding from God in the garden. Remember, they do this ridiculous thing of thinking that they can hide from God. And the interesting thing about shame, right, is that they no longer feel lovable. So shame, in this sense, is a fear of not being loved or lovable. Now, the reason why I talk about this is because, right, we see that with what Jekyll is doing, a lot of what he's doing can be compared to this idea of the ring of Gyges, right? The ring of Gyges, which is a ring that if you turn it on your finger, like if you have a gem, you turn it, so it's not like Gollum where you put it on and you turn invisible, you actually turn it, so it's slightly different. But the point is that if you turn the ring of Gyges, you're invisible and that you no longer can be seen to do what you do before in Plato's Republic, right? The idea is that ultimately what Jekyll is trying to escape on an emotional level. It's hard to know if we're thinking about guilt or thinking about shame on an emotional level, but it doesn't really matter because he's a Calvinist, right? Because he's a Calvinist, right, Jekyll is not necessarily thinking he's not depraved thing already, right? So shame, so on one hand, he's trying to escape shame on the level of just the psyche. He doesn't want to feel bad about going and visiting prostitutes, basically. But the other thing, right, we need to understand this other aspect of shame is the social shame. And that gets into this fear of being rejected, fear of not being loved kind of thing. In a theological sense, it's God will no longer love me because I am now worthless. But in a social sense, shame, right, which is the opposite of honor in a kind of social context, is simply the degree of esteem that you're going to get. If you're shamed, you can be excluded from society, right? So in the Ring of Gyges scenario in Plato's Republic, right, the question is put to Socrates in Plato's writing that the question is it better to be good, or is it simply better to appear good? Is it better to be a good person, or is it better just to not get caught with the terrible things that you do? And in this case, what Jekyll wants to escape with Mr. Hyde, in the freedom that Mr. Hyde gets, is that not only does he not get to, not have to feel any psychological, of things that he did while under the influence of being Hyde, but also we need to understand that he's also looking to escape the social stigma, right? Mr. Hyde is essentially the ring of Gyges. Everything he does, nothing he will ever do as Hyde will come back on him socially, right? He is basically immune to the social judgment of anything he does as Hyde, as long as he can manage to get himself back to being Henry Jekyll, right? But here's the key, and again, this is another huge key, is that it's not just that as Hyde he desires to do these things, right? He desires to do these things, to visit the prostitutes. He desires to do these things as Henry Jekyll, right? And the point of talking about the ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic, Socrates makes the point that even if you don't feel bad about it, and even if you don't face any social consequences of what you do, right? The idea that is being made by Socrates is that the damage to the soul is inescapable. And because the damage to the soul is inescapable, right? Because that part is inescapable, it doesn't even matter if you can escape the feeling of guilt or if you can escape the consequences of punishment. It doesn't matter. To Socrates, right, the idea of virtue is eudaimonia, or good soul. And to have a good soul, you have to be doing good actions. You ultimately damage yourself, right? The thing is, right, what ultimately Jekyll was trying to do as an antidote for shame, and by the way, people, as a metaphor, people would often drink and do drugs in order to give themselves license, that's another word meaning permission, right? To give themselves emotional license to do those things that they wouldn't necessarily, that they might feel bad to do if they were not already under the influence, right? This is again an interesting idea. One of the things that we should also remember in terms of what we are talking about, right? One of the things that we should remember about this idea of escaping shame, and both on the social and the other levels, the damage is inevitable, right? We remember that it talks about it being a tincture, right? Right, which if you don't remember, is a concoction that's given in alcohol. And this idea of it being a tincture is by no means an accident in the mind of Robert Louis Stevenson. And the reason why it's not an accident is because there's this phrase about, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but in vino veritas, right? People will often say the truth that they won't say when they're under the influence of wine, right? And the idea of what alcohol or other drugs can frequently do is it can limit someone's inhibitions, right? And so Jekyll has always wanted to act out. Maybe not act out as horrifically as Hyde ends up doing, but in the end, right, he still, you can't simply say that Jekyll was a good man and Hyde wanted to do all these bad things. No, the whole beginning of this was Jekyll wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to feel virtuous, feel good, have a good soul, eudaimonia, but he also wanted to be able to indulge in all of this dark behavior, but without the consequences, right? And that's ultimately what leads to his destruction, right? And so what we ultimately begin seeing with Jekyll is there becomes an escalation. There's an escalation of the things that go wrong. There's an escalation of the bad things that he's doing. And there's a difficulty of controlling the impulses, which he might have been wanting to let go a little bit, but then the impulses become stronger and stronger, and they begin to horrify him more and more. One of the things that we should be aware in terms of how this can look at from this literary perspective, some people talk about it as a metaphor for sin, or a metaphor for shame, a metaphor for, reason to be a teetotaler, be against alcohol totally, right? He even talks about Paul and Silas, right? He even talks about Paul and Silas. He uses this image of the captives at Philippi, if you don't remember that. And in the situation of the captives at Philippi, we have a situation where St. Paul and St. Silas in Acts chapter 16, they are in jail for being Christians, and then an earthquake basically breaks open the prison and even breaks open their cells, throws open the gates. I mean, it's a really impressive miracle. I'm not really surprised that the jailer converted to Christianity, right? But the description, right, is, again, we're still in the idea, remember in Romans 7, talks, I'm a slave of sin in my members, the divided self, the thing working from within me, right? It suggests that hide, and this is kind of a reverse analogy. He's using the biblical language in a different way. He's talking about hide as having been the one who was restrained, right? And him wanting a kind of glorious reprieve, him wanting to be released, right? Released from shame, released from guilt, released from a lot of these different kinds of things. But the idea of how shame works in a social sense, in a positive sense, is that shame, right, whether it be the consequences of how society will respond to you if you do wrong, or just the internal moral compass, shame is often what keeps us in check. Now, there are certain things, right, that I think I can safely say I will never do. Like, I'm not going to say that I'm not capable of taking the life of another human being. I'm sure that if you push me in a corner or in self-defense, or if a situation were extreme enough, I could probably do that. But there are some things in this world, like if we think about the things in our current society which are held up as being the worst of the worst, I don't think that there's anyone worse in society right now, according to our own social norms, than someone who sexually abuses children, right? Now, the thing is, right, I can honestly say that I'm pretty sure that there's absolutely nothing in this world that can make me do that, because I would prefer death, right? It's one of those things where I can honestly say quite easily I can prefer death. And I'm sure most people, the vast majority of people in society, would say the same, right? Because the shame is simply too great. Now, hopefully that comes from one's own internal conscience. But I know people, for example, Christopher Hitchens is a good example. He was an atheist, right? But he said that if he were ever falsely accused of being a child molester, he would consider suicide. And the reason for that is because even if you weren't personally guilty, even if you weren't feeling the personal shame of that, the social shame of that would be so great, it would be an extremely hard thing to live with. One of the things that really moves me is when you read about the stories of, priests who've been falsely accused and just the incredible amount of hell that they have to go through, right? The idea, right, is that the force of shame in society is a big and active restraint, right? And in that sense, shame, while most of the time when people talk about shame nowadays, the fear of not being loved or lovable, shame is usually a bad thing, but it should also be pointed out that it does have some positive uses if it does keep people from doing terrible things. In the same way, right, this kind of reverse metaphor about referring to hide, like being released, from chains, like the captives of Philippi. The idea that we understand is this is where images of repression really get their strongest force, right? Particularly in the context of things like shame and total depravity. We know that Dr. Jekyll, right, he has been spending so long trying to hold in his urges and be good and he's just wanting to find a safe and or shameless way in which he can let go of some of those things. And he's been living this very divided self. The reason why Robert Louis Stevenson uses this idea of the earthquake is precisely because of it bursting forth with explosive power, right? And unfortunately, right, you can read about that idea of the earthquake and bursting forth with explosive power. Critics have all sorts of ways that they want to interpret that. But what is most key in this idea is that, I think especially understanding it as a literary way, is that repression, right, is always going to go hand in hand with any kind of Calvinist or Victorian society. Anytime if the body is going to be viewed as being negative in itself, if sexuality is going to be demonized as a whole, repression is kind of an inevitability and the destructive force that often comes with living in this very disunified self, right? The idea of, the separation. And no matter what Jekyll tries to do to rid himself of public shame or the private feeling of shame, right? All of that is he's still ultimately going to face the law of sowing and reaping. He is going to ultimately reap what he sows, getting back again to some of the other analogies that have been used before, right? Now, a key idea that, again, relates to this, right? Since we're thinking about how does this relate to this discussion of shame and how does this relate to everything else, right? One of the things, right, that is going on right now in our country is this thing called an opioid crisis, right? And we know in an opioid crisis that what happens is that people oftentimes, because they're in horrible pain, they take opioids and then they get addicted, right? Opioids were beginning to be a problem back then as well. And it was the original opioid, opium, right? Chasing the dragon. And one of the interesting things about what's going on, is that anyone who's either become enslaved to alcohol or enslaved to drugs knows that the hunger that one takes, either whether it to be to feel numb, to make the pain, physical or emotional, go away, it has diminishing returns. You need more and more and more. And it also tends to escalate, right? The need for it, the amount for it, not only does it tend to escalate, but it keeps up with these diminishing returns, right? In the case of Jekyll, not only did his effort to try to escape the punishments of either the moral or the social punishments of shame, not only did it not work, but it actually compounded through his repression. Now, I would like you to imagine something when it comes to how people abuse painkillers, right? We've talked about how pain is a natural feedback loop. It is a good thing. If I put my hand on a stove, ow, right? If I put my hand on a stove, the harm that comes from that is not a good thing, but the pain, i.e. the awareness of the damage, is a good thing. It does, in fact, indeed, tell me to take my hand off the stove. Pain is a gift. A burning hand isn't a gift, but the pain, the ability to jerk it away, instinctively, that's a huge gift. In the sense of what is happening with Jekyll and Hyde, what we are seeing about this idea of dulling shame, whether it be the emotional or the social, is he's actually, not only is he not escaping the damage of what he's doing to himself, but he's actually able to do more damage to himself because he's not able to feel the damage to himself. The more he's damaging his ability to feel that guilt and shame, the more he's actually able to inflict more self-harm, more self-violence onto himself, right? One of the things that we know, right, is that he figures out, unfortunately, because he cannot replicate the experiment, that there was some kind of impurity in the original experiment, and he hunts for what he calls the original salt. Every single time he tries to replicate the experiment with new materials, it always fails. What Jekyll ultimately concludes is that there was something that was wrong with the initial sample and the initial experiment. And so because there was some kind of impurity in the original salt, that's why no matter how much more salt he gets, he cannot replicate the experiment, right? It'll change to green, but then it won't change again to purple like the original sample did, right? The idea of the original salt, some critics link to the idea of an original high, right? Because you have to remember that the way in which Jekyll describes the experience of being Edward Hyde is very much like a high, an exhilaration, a youngness, a newness, a freshness of life. By chasing the original salt, right, the thing that we're talking about is he's unable to duplicate the original experience. And this is such an important idea, right? He is becoming progressively numb to his shame. He's also becoming progressively numb to the damage he's doing to himself. And, right, there's this key idea that he is unable to replicate the original experience. And this, right, this idea of the inability to replicate the original experience is stuff that goes back to literature about people who've had difficulty with opioids for well over a century now, right? I mean, this was not an uncommonly known thing even in Robert Louis Stevenson's time, right? So not only, right, is this attempt to get away from shame, not only is it damaging him, but he's not even able to get back to the thing that he was ever chasing in the first place. Because inside Jekyll there are the desires of Hyde, right? It is always important to remember how they share a womb, divided self, share a tabernacle, everything else. They may be different sides, but the thing that you need to remember is that Jekyll, as he refers to himself, is a composite. While Hyde, he believes, is purely evil, right? In this sense, right, Hyde is like the force of the flesh in St. Paul's Roman chapter 7, right? The war at work in his, when we say the flesh, right? When St. Paul refers to the flesh, he's not saying the body itself is evil. That would be like a totally depraved Calvinist idea. But it's referring to the fallen nature of the flesh, right? The key that we should be aware of here is that because Hyde is considered purely evil, what we really mean is he's just completely consenting to evil. That's what it really means. While Jekyll, right, is only partly consenting to evil. But through that partial consent that leads to the use of the salt and the changing and wanting to delight in certain kinds of wickedness, his ability to say no is being progressively diminished. The same way a person can become more addicted, their will can become more and more. And that's what a vice means, right? If you didn't know, a vice is simply a well-established bad habit that diminishes the person, right? While a virtue, which comes from virtus, which means power or strength, is a habit that strengthens the person, a habit that makes the person better, right? And so we need to understand that Hyde is actually in Jekyll all along. It's only in the Jekyll form, it's only a matter of partial or partly consenting, right? And so the idea of Jekyll and Hyde as being good and evil is actually been a strong misnomer for a long time. And even though a lot of people want to talk about this as an expression of the Freudian subconscious, an expression of certain kinds of psychological or social repression, one of the things that we should understand is that if we're actually paying attention to the way in which Robert Louis Stevenson is structuring this narrative, the analogies and the imagery he uses is much closer to a biblical or a theological or a Pauline Presbyterian interpretation, right? I mean, you can talk about how it's psychological as much as you want, but a lot of this stuff is just clearly references to things more akin to Romans chapter 7, although there are all sorts of psychological and also social implications as well, which we really cannot ignore. So hold on, my screen went dark here. I need to see what time we're at. Okay, we're at 33. Okay, so one of the things, in terms of this idea, right, of different terms, right, because, it talks about, perennial, always coming back, right, inveterately, right, inveterately, so it's the well-established habit. All of these are classical words talking about virtue and vice, right, things that, and this idea of a divided self, right, and the consistent degradation, right? There's this idea of a consistent degradation that we are looking at. The degradation of Henry Jekyll, right? Because we'll notice that it describes him with words like comely, right? Referring to his hand, right? Because when he wakes up as Hyde, he normally has a comely hand, which is normally beautiful, fair, right? While you have Hyde's hand, which is referred to as swart, right? Which basically means black or ugly. We see some of the common Western associations of being fairer skinned with being more beautiful here. But an important idea that we see in this physical transformation, right? The idea that there's a physical association with the degradation, right? Just similar to the idea of moral degradation equals physical degradation. In the same time, vices like gluttony, makes a person less healthy, while a good habit like exercise makes a person stronger, right? In the same sense, right, we see that Hyde is significantly less beautiful, his looks are deteriorated, but what Hyde ultimately is, it's simply the end result of the unchecked appetite, right? I mean, if I didn't uncheck my appetite, I'd be over 300 pounds, and then I'd be really ugly, and you could call me Mr. Hyde. But we'll notice, right, that ultimately the constant biblical references, right? For example, the idea of the finger on the wall, which, you know, if you remember the finger on the wall, it's from Daniel, right? That's also where you get the phrase, the writings on the wall. And what was that? What was the finger on the wall image in the book of Daniel? And if you don't remember, it was because King Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, was drinking and toasting to his own gods and getting drunk with the gold and silver that they stole from the temple in Jerusalem. It was both an act of idolatry, true, but make no mistake, it's also an act of revelry, of drunkenness, right? And what does that result in? What does it result? What is ultimately the result of Belshazzar's drunkenness and now this insult to God, right? From a historical point of view, Belshazzar wanted to be one of those party boy, playboy kings, right? Like the whole point of him getting out all of those sacred vessels and using them for his party is he wanted to have a drunken orgy with his wives and his concubines and his nobles, right? And he just wanted to live it up. He wanted to live a life totally excluded, you know, to this hedonistic version of pleasure, which, by the way, rich people in Victorian times, they sometimes like to do the same things. But Belshazzar's kingdom, right, the Babylonians, ultimately gets taken over by, I believe, by King Darius and the Persians, right? There is another, again, all of these biblical allusions are not being used not on purpose, right? So, for example, Belshazzar, by being a drunken king, right? The idea is if you're drunk and not doing what you're supposed to do, you're creating a lot of internal damage. You don't have a unified court. You're not leading. You're just, you know, wasting all your time as a king. And then your enemies can come in and take over from the outside. Does that make sense, right? The destruction of the finger on the wall is a warning of destruction that happens from within, right? And so that's why this is the illusion that's made when, you know, this is the finger on the wall, right? When he wakes up as Hyde, right? That his looseness, his license, his consent to evil has gone so far that it's actually bringing about not only his moral destruction, but also his physical and actual destruction, right? Again, linking to these images of temperance and drug use and how ultimately that self-division is going to create a total cracking of the whole, right? Because if he talks about, right, when he uses different things, like he talks about, bravos, right? A bravos being a hired thug, someone to be brave on your behalf, right? It's this idea of wickedness that you do, like someone else does the wickedness for you, and that's what Hyde kind of is, in terms of, that's what Hyde is, in terms, you know, he's Jekyll's bravos, he gets to do all the dirty things he wants to do for him. But this other idea, right, is that, you know, when it's talking about how, as Hyde, he experiences a delirium, right? This is another word generally associated with opiates, but it's also can be associated with people being delirious when they have fevers, etc. But delirium, right, again, understand that it doesn't just mean like, it can mean disoriented due to drugs or to fever. You know, it can mean like a state of semi-madness, but it can also refer to a state of ecstasy, which also refers to Hyde as well, and the joy in which he experienced, right? This idea of a physical degeneration, right, and the idea of everything falling apart, right, we'll notice that there are other architectural words that are being used, right? So we have references to the tabernacle, we have references to the divided house. He talked about when he was trying to reinforce himself against Hyde, he uses the word buttressed, which is an architectural term meaning support, right? Basically, his house is falling apart, right? And that's the idea. Belshazzar's house, the finger on the wall, right? Your house, your kingdom will be given to another, right? And the physical deterioration is symbolic of not only a moral degeneration, but a social degeneration and even a physical degeneration that are being brought about, by these vices, right? And what we can see in a lot of this, right, is that there is not only just this, and we see, right, that all of this is the fact that this is all still Jekyll, right? It's not just that Hyde is taken over by a bad habit. It's that, or that he's taken over by Hyde via a bad habit. He's also taken over by his own pride, right? It talks about how he has this effulgence, right? This is, like shining forth good. I mean, how often do you see that word? Effulgence, right? But a key idea that we should understand is that there are two kinds of, when you're beaming, right? There's the goodness of Jekyll, which would beam out, right? But we also see similar kinds of excitement in Hyde as well. And we also see that Jekyll often has very high thoughts and very egotistical thoughts that bring him into ecstasy and joy as well. So we remember, right, that when he talks about himself and his own movement through life, right, he refers to himself as moving at a plod, right, just plodding along, a slow walk. But on the contrary, Hyde doesn't plod, he springs, right, kind of like being released from the earthquake, right? And if we remember, what was Hyde's reaction when Lanyon brought the chemicals, right? This sob of like incoherent joy and relief, right? A kind of scary effulgence itself, right? There's this idea that even though we should not assume, right, that this evil, that the thing that ultimately that Jekyll has endured is anything that just happens because he indulged in Hyde. It was something that was already in him, the seed of it was already in him, and he then nurtured it and brought it along. It had to be habitual in order to create the overall moral and then later physical death. One of the important ideas that connects kind of the physical and the moral is the idea of referring to something as a scruple. A scruple, right, it can refer to either a small weight or a pebble, or it can also refer to like a small sin or a small pang of conscience, right? The idea, again, is that even though it might seem like a small thing, right, the small weight, the scruple, right, that little bit of chemical, or if we wanted to make a Breaking Bad reference, like that little bit of crystal meth or whatever it can be, it may not have a lot of physical weight, but if it is indulged, if it is set free, it can be allowed to bring about the total disintegration of the person, right? Because you have to understand that in Robert Louis Stevenson's mind, right, he is not going to be one of those people who suggests that alcohol is the root of all evil, right? Because he believes that human beings are rather depraved already, right? But the idea is that he's maybe putting forth is that opiates, alcohol, drugs, all these other kinds of things, what they do is that little scruple, that chemical whatever, it morally and physically affects someone where it feeds their vices and it can lead them to their total disintegration and everything getting out of control, right? That's the general idea. Now, so this is kind of the ways in which the theological, moral, temperate interpretation of Hyde is put forward. So I'm getting pretty close to 45 minutes. There's still one more thing that I'm going to have to talk about. Man, I've been at this for a while. But there's still one more, and we have to talk about it in terms of the Darwinian and the evolutionary sense of it. We have to talk about the final transformations and what that does and how that happens. And we also have to talk about the references to Hyde as being ape-like and being like a brute. And that gets into the Darwinian and some of the social Darwinist and other political and social ideas that are going on. So today, right, again, I know it was still largely talking about certain, member sexual stuff, but it is still important. It was still important to bring that in to the theological side of the analysis. So I'm going to stop this video for now because I need some water, and I'm going to pick it right back up. Whew.